Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a story about a tiny mushroom that has quietly fascinated humans for thousands of years. Unlike other psychedelics that announce themselves with flashing lights or dramatic explosions, magic mushrooms sneak into your mind like a mischievous librarian, reorganizing thoughts, tickling perception, and whispering jokes only you can hear. They make a cloud pause mid-drift, a shadow wink, a chair slightly more opinionated than usual, and somehow, across centuries, humans keep returning, curious, cautious, and occasionally absurdly awestruck, because the world feels just a little stranger and funnier in their presence. But before we follow the ancestor who swore the moon winked back at him, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy these slow, absurd tales. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're lying right now, perhaps tucked under a blanket halfway between curiosity and sleep. Now, dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a time before clocks, before sidewalks, before anyone thought, maybe I shouldn't eat this fungus. Humans, your ancestors, were wandering forests, caves, and grasslands with bare feet, crude tools, and insatiable curiosity. They picked berries, roots, sometimes mushrooms, and occasionally, by sheer accident or divine mischief, found the ones that whispered strange, vivid things into their minds. Somewhere, someone nudged a bright little mushroom with their toe and paused, cocking an eyebrow at the damp soil, thinking, this smells funny, tastes funny, and oh my, the trees are very opinionated today. You, of course, are that person now, except with better posture, more awareness, and slightly less risk of poisoning. But back then, humans were daring. They experimented with nature the way they experimented with fire, enthusiastically, clumsily, and sometimes with dramatic regret. Evidence suggests that by around 9000 BCE, in what is now Siberia, people were already noting mushrooms that seemed to sing inside your head if you ate them. Siberian shamans, clever, mischievous, and occasionally bored after long reindeer hunts, would chew and share these Fungian rituals. Sometimes it was to heal, sometimes to terrify, sometimes because everyone needed entertainment after a long day of dodging wolves and frostbite. And yes, reindeer were involved. Yes, they were probably the unsuspecting wingmen in humanity's first psychedelic experiments. You can imagine them trotting through the tundra with suspicious eyes, ears flicking like radar dishes, wondering why humans suddenly found the world slightly too bright and oddly hilarious. The mushrooms were subtle instructors. They taught patience, curiosity, humility, and occasionally that gravity could feel subjective if you stared long enough at a patch of moss. You kneel beside a fallen log and notice a cluster of these tiny caps, gleaming faintly in the cold Siberian light, like miniature beacons of curiosity. You imagine a shaman leaning close, whispering instructions to the spores. Show them what the trees know. Teach them about the river's secrets. Make the stars giggle. And somehow, across the centuries, the mushrooms have been obeying ever so quietly. Fast forward a few millennia, and suddenly you're in ancient Mesoamerica, standing on sun-warmed stone steps outside a temple, the smell of cacao and burning copal incense curling in the air. The Aztecs, never ones to overlook anything capable of teaching, healing, or slightly terrifying their neighbours, had developed a whole festival calendar around these fungi. They called them Teonanacatl, roughly translated as God's flesh, and you try saying it aloud. The syllables roll across your tongue with a subtle mischief. The mushrooms themselves seem to laugh at you, or possibly with you. You're never quite sure if it is laughter or the sound of centuries of anticipation in your mouth. During ceremonies, priests would eat these mushrooms to communicate with gods, ancestors, or sometimes just their neighbours if the vision seemed especially ambitious that day. You watch them from a distance, their movements deliberate, their faces serious, and yet there is a hint of giggle in the tilt of a head, the twitch of an eyebrow, as though they are aware that the divine and the ridiculous often occupy the same space. Then the Spanish arrived, all shiny armour and moral panic, and looked on these practices with predictable horror. Clearly the forest has taken over entirely, they thought. They banned the mushrooms, which only made them more mysterious and desirable, humans being naturally contrarian. Somewhere in the shadows, you see an Aztec elder snickering. Meanwhile, back in Europe, mushrooms had a quieter, slightly more absurd trajectory. Monks occasionally painted them in illuminated manuscripts, which, to be fair, might have been because the fungi were visually compelling, or perhaps because a monk had seen one wobble in the rain and thought, yes, there is a story here, somewhere. Herbalists occasionally used mushrooms in remedies, often without the faintest clue that some of these little caps would later inspire novels, music, and very confusing dinner table conversations in 1966. You can picture a medieval monk, candlelight flickering over a face worn thin by study, squinting at a mushroom and thinking, yes, this will cure something, probably something. Occasionally, it worked. Occasionally, it did not. Occasionally, the monk stayed awake all night, wondering if the peasants were laughing at him, and in truth, they probably were. Across the centuries through Siberian tundras, Mesoamerican temples, and European villages, magic mushrooms were quietly teaching humans something important, nothing as trivial as philosophy, taxes, or the proper way to argue with a neighbour. They were teaching that eating a small, colourful fungus could make the world slightly stranger, slightly funnier, and certainly more alive than you expected. They taught humans that perception is flexible, that caution is sometimes hilarious, and that even the most mundane soil can contain marvels. And you, wandering across these centuries in this moment, feel a subtle, almost imperceptible shiver of recognition. The mushrooms themselves, patient, persistent, and oddly witty, have always been conspiring to make life just a little less ordinary. You lean down, brushing soil and moss from your fingertips, and feel their quiet insistence. They have been here for millennia, waiting for curious humans like you to notice the world's absurdity and its beauty, all in one soft, mind-expanding bite. And you, in this timeless moment, cannot help but smile. You step forward, and the forest melts away beneath your feet, replaced by sun-warmed stone plazas and towering temples that smell faintly of incense, cacao, and dust. You're in the heart of ancient Mesoamerica, where magic mushrooms were far more than edible curiosities. They were teachers, gateways, and occasionally mischievous tricksters. You watch as priests, robed in feathers and ochre, gather the sacred fungi in small trembling hands, each cap glistening with dew like tiny magical crowns. The mushrooms, known to these people as Therapeutic, or God's flesh, are never idle. They hum faintly in the mind, or perhaps that is just the effect of anticipation and warm jungle air on your imagination. Eating them was not casual, it was ceremonial. Priests consumed them to see visions, to hear advice from ancestors, or sometimes, inexplicably, to get a laugh at the cosmos's expense. You imagine that somewhere a mushroom is internally chuckling, watching humans take careful bites while the gods whisper, "You have no idea how funny this is." You wander through one of these ceremonies, noticing the peculiar rhythm of chanting that rises and falls like waves. A feathered headdress bobs, the smoke from burning copal curls into the sky, and the smell of roasted cacao drifts over you. Someone sways too vigorously, knocking over a bowl of mushrooms. The crowd gasps, then laughs nervously, a delicate mixture of reverence and mild chaos. You watch, aware that the forest, the fungi, the ritual, and your own heart are all dancing to a rhythm older than written history. And then, history never waits politely, the Spanish arrive. You hear the scrape of armour on stone and the clatter of horses' hooves, both loud enough to startle even the most seasoned priests. The conquerors look upon these ceremonies, these gatherings of humans laughing, crying, and sometimes falling over in awe, and react with predictable alarm. Diabolical, they cry. Horrifying, they declare. You can almost hear a distant mushroom mutter, "Really? That's your hot take after 3,000 years of human curiosity?" The Spanish tried to ban mushrooms, to stamp out their sacred use, to erase traditions. Of course, humans being humans, the more forbidden the mushroom became, the more mysterious and irresistible it was. You follow a Mazatec elder through a dense jungle, past glinting rivers and mossy rocks, as they whisper instructions about which mushrooms are safe, which are sacred, and which should simply be left alone. You imagine that same elder centuries later, sighing at anthropologists fumbling with notebooks, trying to describe something that resists being described. You hear the faint echo of laughter across time, as if the mushrooms themselves are telling you that understanding is optional. Experience is mandatory. While the Spanish scribbled in leather-bound ledgers about sinful ceremonies, the locals continued their work with a quiet persistence that is almost audacious. You watch a young apprentice consume a tiny cap, eyes widening, body swaying, as visions of stars dancing above the forest canopy unfold. You feel the faint tug of these visions, yourself, not overwhelming, just enough to remind you that consciousness is stretchy, flexible, and occasionally absurd. Somewhere a monkey screeches. You imagine it is commenting on the whole spectacle. Humans, always so serious, yet so easy to entertain. Even after centuries of suppression, the mushroom survived in secret. Families passed knowledge down, small villages held hidden ceremonies, and the sacred teachings persisted like whispers in a canyon. You walk past a ritual circle etched in stone and soil, imagining the countless barefoot humans who knelt here before you. Some were healers, some were dreamers, some were simply curious and slightly reckless. And yet, all of them learned something subtle, something vital, that these small fungi could make humans see the world's strangeness and humour, its danger and deflight, all at once. The Spanish may have called it heresy. You call it education. Humorous, slightly terrifying, and endlessly imaginative. You step back and notice the sky above, vivid, warm, and endless. Somewhere between the temples and the forest, the mushrooms are still working their quiet magic. A priest tips a hat in your direction. A mushroom winks from the ground, and you, standing across centuries, understand that human fascination with these fungi is as old as hunger, curiosity, and laughter. And yet, as always, you notice the smallest detail. A leaf brushing the side of a cap, a faint scent of earth and spice, the soft murmur of someone chanting just beyond sight. You lean closer, because sleep stories require attention to tiny things, and you realize that these ceremonies are not only historical, they are alive. Every step you take echoes across time. The Siberian tundras, the Mesoamerican jungles, the candlelit European monasteries, all connected by a single thread of curiosity, caution, and occasional hilarity. And in this thread, you notice the first lesson the mushrooms have been offering humans for millennia. Experience is worth more than caution, laughter is worth more than fear, and the world is always stranger and more beautiful than it seems. You breathe deeply, letting the tropical air fill your lungs, letting history fold softly into your mind, letting the faint hum of the mushrooms guide you to sleep with just a hint of mischief in your heart. You step now across an ocean of time and land, from the sun-warmed plazas of Mesoamerica to the damp, cobbled streets of medieval Europe, where mushrooms are less sacred and more mysterious, or occasionally sinister, depending on who is holding the candle. You can almost smell the musty manuscripts in monasteries, the tang of fermenting ale in taverns, the mud squishing under the boots of peasants who consider fungi a minor nuisance or a midnight snack, depending on hunger and superstition. Europeans, as you quickly notice, had a complicated relationship with mushrooms. Some were curious, some terrified, and some simply indifferent until a sudden, hallucinatory encounter convinced them otherwise. You find yourself peering into a scriptorium, candlelight flickering over parchment, watching a monk draw a mushroom with more care than he had ever shown for the sermons he copied. The colours are exaggerated, the forms whimsical, and you suspect that by the time he finished, the mushroom was laughing quietly at his attempts at taxonomy. It was not only the monks who were fascinated. Herbalists, apothecaries, and wandering healers occasionally recommended mushrooms for vague ailments. Perhaps it was an excess of humoral theory, perhaps desperation, perhaps curiosity. Hard to say. You imagine a woman in a village, hands red from boiling herbs, staring at a small brown cap and thinking, well, it is round, it is odd, and it has been here longer than my patience, so why not? Sometimes it cured the headache, sometimes it caused visions, sometimes it caused headaches worse than the original ones, along with an awkward conversation with the neighbours. History is full of these minor catastrophes and occasional triumphs, all documented in whispers and sketches, some of which have survived just long enough for you to marvel at their absurdity. You wander further into the forests and meadows outside the villages. Here the mushrooms grow quietly, largely unnoticed except by children and the occasional forager with a taste for mischief. You imagine a small boy, barefoot and curious, plucking a tiny cap and hiding it behind a bush, not because it is sacred, not because it is dangerous, but simply because it might do something. You smile, because humans have not changed so much. The boy sneaks home, the parents frown, and somewhere across the continent the mushrooms whisper, yes, curiosity is always rewarded, sometimes with wonder, sometimes with chaos. Mushrooms also appeared in the margins of illuminated manuscripts, which you realise were part history, part advice column, and part subtle joke. Angels and devils appear alongside odd fungi, sometimes indistinguishable from each other in size and intent. You lean closer and notice that the scribe may have been exaggerating slightly, perhaps imagining that a particular mushroom had eyes, or a sly grin, or the ability to judge the wearer of the monk's robe. Occasionally you wonder if these illustrations were less about the mushrooms themselves and more about the scribe's appreciation for absurdity, and you nod solemnly, because the universe is often delivered with humour in small doses. By the 16th and 17th centuries, European explorers had returned from the Americas, tales of Teotihuacan tucked carefully between lines about gold and conquest. Some scholars dismissed the reports as fantastical, others were intrigued, and some quietly made plans to replicate the ceremonies in their own libraries, minus the human sacrifice, plus a few more candles naturally. You imagine an academic, quill in hand, sketching a mushroom, muttering, "It cannot possibly do anything, but just in case. Perhaps I will chew it later at a discreet hour." And, of course, some did. Some experienced visions, others headaches, and a few felt that the mushrooms were silently laughing at all of them, as they always did. Superstition and folklore grew alongside fascination. In some regions, mushrooms were considered fairy food, devilish, or bewitched. You walk through a misty European forest in your imagination, boots crunching on fallen leaves, and noticed tiny fairy rings forming naturally in mossy clearings. Villagers stepped cautiously around them, certain that entering a circle could result in hours, days, or weeks of dancing under an invisible moon lost to time, or worse, mildly embarrassed when they return. You chuckle quietly because, like all things magical, mushrooms seem to have a sense of humour that transcends culture, geography, and reason. And yet, despite these stories, the mushrooms endured. They thrived quietly in damp meadows, behind stone walls, in fields trampled by livestock. Peasants and nobles alike learned, slowly and haphazardly, that these little fungi could provoke laughter, hallucinations, or insight, sometimes simultaneously. You watch a farmer accidentally step on one, pause, frown, and then shrug, muttering something about the forest's patience and the persistence of odd things in life. The mushroom does not retaliate. It waits. It knows it has time. Time has been its greatest ally for millennia. Across Europe, through superstition, curiosity, trial and error, magic mushrooms were becoming quietly infamous. They were the subject of whispered warnings and polite inquiries, of careful sketches and overly serious treatises. And you, wandering this layered history, notice the same subtle truth that Siberian shamans and Mesoamerican priests had understood centuries before. The mushrooms are patient, they wait, they teach, they laugh quietly when humans assume they are in control. They are small, unassuming, yet unyieldingly, mischievously profound. And somehow you feel the faint tug of their ancient humour in your own mind, a reminder that curiosity, even when met with caution or superstition, has always been the beginning of discovery, wonder, and a very human kind of absurdity. You leave the candlelit monasteries and misty European forests behind, stepping onto the decks of creaking ships bound for lands you have only glimpsed in maps inked with uncertain lines. The air smells of salt, tar, and anticipation. Somewhere below deck, a sailor mutters about seasickness and the unreliability of cooked beans. But you pay little attention. Your eyes are fixed on the promise of new worlds, forests, and most importantly, mushrooms. The age of exploration, as historians would later call it, was really an era of humans misunderstanding everything and then writing meticulously about it. You watch European naturalists stepping onto foreign soil, notebooks in hand, quills poised like tiny swords ready to conquer knowledge with the precision of someone who has never actually stepped in mud before. The mushrooms in these new lands are everywhere. Delicate caps hiding in the undergrowth, brilliant reds peeking through moss, subtle browns almost invisible to the untrained eye. You bend to inspect one, and it seems to shiver slightly, aware that yet another human is cataloguing its life story in the margins of a leather-bound book. Explorers and naturalists develop a curious habit. Name first, understand later. A mushroom with 3 stems, Latinized immediately, one that glows faintly at dusk, classified in excruciating detail. You imagine them sitting by candlelight, debating the subtle differences between Amanita muscaria and something that looks suspiciously like it but insists on being independent. Somewhere, a mushroom size, humans are adorable when they overcomplicate things. In North and South America, colonial observers encounter indigenous mushroom practices with a mix of horror, awe, and awkward curiosity. They write notes about ceremonies, about priests consuming fungi, about visions and chants, and occasionally they misinterpret everything entirely. They worship a tiny fungus that makes them giggle, one might scribble. Surely this is evidence of Satan, another adds. You notice, walking across this historical tableau, that the mushrooms themselves do not care. They wait patiently, teaching what they can, ignoring human moral panic. Meanwhile, Europeans are obsessed with documenting everything. Leaves, birds, insects, and yes, fungi. The mushroom is the perfect subject for scientific humour. Delicate enough to inspire awe, mysterious enough to provoke panic, and completely indifferent to the human frenzy around it. You watch an amateur botanist press a cap between pages of a book, muttering about spore patterns and the dangers of consumption, as if the mushroom cares. Somewhere in the undergrowth, a wild mushroom smirks. The colonial era also introduces you to absurdity on a new scale. Naturalists sail across oceans to describe flora that the locals already know intimately. Tribes, shamans, and villages have generations of experience with these fungi, but Europeans, armed with notebooks and a near-religious faith in classification, treat every mushroom as a newly discovered miracle. You imagine a meeting of naturalists in a tropical forest, one holding a mushroom upside down like it is a priceless artifact, arguing over its correct genus while a jaguar watches from the shadows, silently judging everyone's enthusiasm. And then there is the subtle magic of cross-cultural confusion. You watch a local guide patiently explaining which mushrooms are edible, sacred, or slightly mischievous, only to have the visiting European mishear and note in his journal. This species causes divine visions. Also, probably safe to eat with cheese. The mushrooms naturally remain impartial. They know that humans require mistakes, misunderstandings, and exaggerated reports to appreciate their quiet wonder. By the late 18th century, mushrooms are firmly embedded in the minds of curious Europeans, yet still elusive, playful, and mostly unclaimed. They survive wars, navigation errors, and the occasional misinformed dinner party. The forests of the Americas, Asia, and Africa shelter them, teaching humans patience, observation, and humility. You wander through a dense colonial garden, inhaling the scent of wet soil, flowering herbs, and faintly sweet fungal spores, imagining generations of explorers recording, misrecording, and over-recording their findings. Somewhere a mushroom chuckles softly, delighted by its unintentional celebrity. And as you trace your fingers along a moss-covered stone in a tropical clearing, you notice the constant. Despite all human effort, classification, and misinterpretation, the mushrooms endure. They remain playful, mysterious, and slightly ironic. They are witnesses to centuries of human folly, fascination, and fumbling attempts at understanding. You realize the lesson they have quietly been imparting across oceans and continents is simple. Humans may travel far, take meticulous notes, and declare themselves authorities on all things alive, but the mushrooms, patient, resilient, and mischievously wise, always maintain the upper hand. In this moment, as you pause to inhale the humid jungle air, you sense the quiet humour of history itself. That discovery is rarely neat. Understanding is optional, and magic, no matter how rigorously studied, is often found in the margin notes, the mistakes, and the tiny, laughing fungi quietly teaching patience and curiosity. You take one last step into the undergrowth, feeling that faint shiver of recognition, knowing that the mushrooms are still waiting, still observing, still silently insisting that the world is far stranger and far funnier than humans give it credit for. You step into a world lit by candlelight and reason, where curiosity has been polished like silver and human ambition reaches the stars, or at least attempts to classify everything that moves, grows, or occasionally laughs at you from the forest floor. You're now in the Enlightenment, a time when Europeans have decided that the universe is orderly, understandable, and certainly capable of being catalogued in books that smell faintly of ink and self-importance. Mushrooms, of course, are not exempt from this scrutiny. You find yourself in a laboratory, or more accurately, a cramped study filled with glass jars, pressed specimens, and a suspiciously large pile of quills, where a group of scholars has dedicated itself to observing fungi with the intensity normally reserved for monarchs and gold coins. You watch as one of them peers through a magnifying glass at a tiny cap and declares with solemnity, "It is round, it is brown, therefore it is significant." Somewhere in the shadows a mushroom sighs, amused by the human need to create order where none was necessary. You wander through this world of classification and experiment, noticing the meticulous notebooks filled with diagrams, Latin names, and often wildly inaccurate observations. One scholar insists that mushrooms are related to flowers, another that they are a kind of soil animal, and yet another that they are a divine joke played on humanity by the cosmos itself. You cannot help but chuckle softly, because centuries of experience suggest that the last option may be closest to the truth. Philosophers of the era ponder mushrooms with a seriousness that borders on the absurd. You imagine sitting in a smoky salon listening as someone debates whether eating a fungus can improve morality, taste, or even public speaking skills. You sip your tea carefully, aware that somewhere beneath the table a mushroom cap sits patiently, quietly observing human pretension with the wisdom of centuries. Occasionally the mushroom shudders, perhaps delighted by a minor error in reasoning, perhaps merely amused by a quill that rolls off the desk. It is also a time of experimentation. You watch a scholar prepare a mushroom infusion, carefully noting colour, texture and effects, while muttering about humours, spirits, and invisible particles that may or may not exist. You naturally are a participant in this process, though slightly more relaxed than your predecessors. Somewhere between the second sip and the third, your perception shifts slightly. The walls of the laboratory seem softer, the candlelight dances with unusual enthusiasm, and the mushroom, ever patient, nudges your awareness towards subtle amusement. The Enlightenment also brings a peculiar tension. Science demands order, yet mushrooms resist it. You witness scholars arguing over classification, insisting on exact measurements, while ignoring the faint giggle of nature at their efforts. "It must have gills," one declares. "No, it grows in circles. Therefore it is a circle," another insists. Somewhere a mushroom cap nods politely, aware that humans will never fully understand it, but enjoying their attempts immensely. Meanwhile, the broader public grows increasingly curious. Travellers return from distant lands with tales of exotic fungi, ceremonial uses and hallucinatory experiences. Some write in awe, others in horror, and some in diaries that will later become treasured historical oddities. You imagine yourself reading one of these diaries by firelight, noting the descriptions of mushrooms that speak to the mind or sing quietly in the belly. You smile because this is exactly the combination of accuracy and exaggeration that has always defined the human fascination with fungi. Even in an era of reason, the mushrooms continue to teach subtle lessons. You watch a young apprentice carefully measure spores, unaware that the mushroom has already expanded, contracted, and perhaps rolled its tiny invisible eyes at the human need for precision. The lesson is simple but timeless. Humans may catalogue, debate, and theorize, but the mushrooms operate on their own schedule, indifferent to moral, philosophical, or scientific scrutiny. By the late 18th century, the Enlightenment has given humans knowledge, curiosity, and the occasional headache from overthinking. Mushrooms, patient and quiet, have given humans humility, wonder, and the faintest nudge of mischief. You feel that tug as you lean against a weathered laboratory table, inhaling the scent of ink, soil, and faintly sweet spores. History whispers in your ear. Experience is often stranger than explanation. Humour is often wiser than solemnity, and the world is always slightly more alive and absurd than humans are willing to admit. And in that soft, candle-lit glow, you realise something remarkable. Across continents, centuries and cultural revolutions, mushrooms have quietly maintained their role as teachers, tricksters and companions to those willing to look, taste and imagine. You close your eyes briefly, letting the lesson settle, that curiosity, humility and laughter are eternal, and that humans, for all their cleverness, are only beginning to notice the subtle wisdom beneath those small, patient and mysteriously resilient caps. You leave the candlelit laboratories of Enlightenment Europe behind, stepping now into forests and villages that hum with lives older than empires. The scent of damp earth, smoke from cooking fires, and faintly sweet spores fills your nostrils. Here, mushrooms are neither curiosities to be classified nor tools of moral panic. They are teachers, companions, and subtle pranksters woven into the fabric of human life for centuries. Across North and South America, Indigenous communities continue to safeguard knowledge that European explorers, naturalists and clerics could barely comprehend. You wander alongside a Mazatec shaman, barefoot on soft soil, the morning mist curling around your ankles. He points to a small cluster of mushrooms, and you feel the quiet insistence of generations whispering through the forest. These fungi are sacred, these fungi are playful, and yes, these fungi are profoundly indifferent to your notebook. The shaman demonstrates carefully, chewing a tiny cap and distributing small pieces to the gathered apprentices. Your second-person perspective catches every detail. The shimmer of dew on the caps, the subtle changes in posture as vision and imagination begin to stir, the careful ritual gestures that acknowledge the spirits of the forest and the mischievous spirits of the fungi. You realise that centuries of practice, observation and lived experience have distilled a knowledge far subtler and more precise than the most meticulous European journals. Meanwhile, colonial pressures loom. Governments, missionaries and missionaries-turned-bureaucrats insist that all rituals be banned, rewritten or suppressed. You can hear the faint rattle of laws and edicts moving through the forest, carried by scribes who barely understand the culture they seek to regulate. Indigenous communities respond with quiet resilience. Ceremonies move to hidden clearings, practices are passed in whispers, and the mushrooms themselves endure, patiently, like tiny sentinels of cultural memory. You notice how every footstep in this forest seems to carry a secret, knowledge preserved in subtle gestures, careful words, and the gentle observation of fungi that have been laughing at humanity's clumsiness for millennia. Children learn early. You see a small girl crouching near a mossy log, her fingers brushing over caps with reverence and curiosity. She learns which to avoid, which to respect, and which may reveal visions if approached with patience and intention. Somewhere, you imagine, a mushroom watches her, thinking, "Ah, a promising student." Not like these adults who write endless notes and miss the point entirely. You nod knowingly because this is historically exactly how wisdom survives. Quietly, persistently, and with a sly sense of humour. Travellers from distant city occasionally intrude, curious or condescending, carrying notions of scientific superiority or moral duty. They write notes, sketch diagrams and ask awkward questions, and the mushrooms remain perfectly indifferent. You imagine a visitor tipping a hat awkwardly, muttering about superstitious rituals, while the local shaman smiles faintly and allows the mushroom to take its natural course. Somewhere, a mushroom cap quivers, silently delighted by the human insistence that everything be explained, measured or controlled. Colonial pressures also create ingenious strategies. Communities use coded language, subtle gestures, and the careful timing of ceremonies to ensure continuity of knowledge. You feel the rhythm of this preservation, the way cultural memory is stitched into daily life. A mushroom harvested for ritual use doubles as a teaching tool. A story, whispered under the stars, carries centuries of botanical, spiritual, and humorous knowledge. You sense that the fungi themselves are collaborators in this preservation, their patience stretching across generations, quietly reinforcing resilience, humility, and subtle joy. Even as the 19th century ushers in new technologies, maps, and modern ambitions, these mushrooms continue their quiet work. You notice them thriving in fields, forests, and riverbanks, oblivious to the human dramas around them. They are witnesses to history, humorously recording every misunderstanding, misclassification, and awkward moral panic. You lean closer, inhaling the damp forest air, faintly sweet spores tickling your senses, and realize that the mushroom has been the perfect silent teacher, patient, whimsical, and infinitely observant. By the end of the century, you see a subtle truth emerging. Human curiosity, suppression, and ambition can bend history, but they cannot erase it. Indigenous knowledge persists, often hidden from formal records, passed orally and experientially. The mushrooms endure as partners in this transmission, their quiet humour evident in the timing of visions, the subtle patterns of growth, and the occasional oops moment when a human misjudges potency. You, standing in this timeless forest, notice the continuity, a thread connecting Siberian shamans, Mesoamerican priests, European botanists, and the children learning in secret. The mushrooms have been the constant, patient, and irreverently humorous guides, and in this moment you feel it, the soft shiver of recognition that every bite, every whispered story, every careful observation is part of a lineage stretching across continents and centuries. You step carefully over a patch of moss, brushing your fingers against a tiny cap, and sense the subtle lesson. Knowledge is not only preserved through records and books, but through attention, patience, and humour. Mushrooms, in their quiet, resilient way, have always understood this better than humans ever could. You step into the cusp of modernity, where cobblestone streets give way to manicured gardens, gas lamps glow with polite insistence, and the wealthy elite of Europe and North America decide that curiosity must be elevated with a sense of style. You walk through one such garden, dew glinting on roses, peacocks strutting in ridiculous pomp, and small clusters of mushrooms pushing audaciously through the damp soil, as if they too have been invited to the salons of the surreal. The era has a peculiar rhythm, fin de siècle fascination mingled with vanity. You watch a banker in a perfectly tailored suit tiptoe toward a scarlet-capped amanita, notebook in hand, muttering, "For science!" somewhere between sincerity and mild terror. Meanwhile, a poet, smudged with charcoal and confidence, leans over, inhaling spores delicately, certain that visions of divine insight are imminent, or at least a very interesting anecdote to recite at dinner parties. The mushrooms, ever patient, remain indifferent, nudging the imagination just enough to make participants question whether brilliance or embarrassment will arrive first. Amateur experimentation is rife. You imagine a small society of curious elites, gathering in greenhouse-like salons, candles flickering, ferns swaying gently in the corners. Conversations range from serious ethno-botanical observations to dramatic anecdotes of someone who saw angels riding hedgehogs after a single taste. You notice the faint scent of damp soil mingled with tobacco and perfumed hair, and realize that the mushroom's subtle power is amplified by human expectation, vanity, and overconfidence. In North America, ethnobotanical collections flourish. Museums and universities receive specimens shipped across oceans, carefully packed, labelled and documented with a precision that suggests either genius or obsession, or both. You can almost hear the fungi laughing silently inside their boxes, aware that they are both studied and misunderstood, admired and feared, tiny icons of nature's enduring irreverence. European precursors of modern psychedelia, like early chemists and botanists, take notes with rigorous fascination. You witness one scientist scribbling furiously. A tiny red fungus emits a curious effect, possibly neurological, must repeat, must measure, must write to friends, must appear composed in public. Somewhere, a mushroom cap wobbles slightly, delighted by human insistence on methodical observation, when all it takes is a quiet moment of attention, patience, and imagination. Amid these gatherings, subtle humour emerges naturally. Someone spills wine on a table, another trips over a garden hose, and yet another sneezes dramatically, misting a cluster of mushrooms with unexpected moisture. You, the observer, sense the rhythm of human error and fascination interweaving seamlessly with the quiet patience of the fungi. For every meticulously recorded spore print, there is an absurdity, a misunderstanding, an overestimation of potency, a faintly ridiculous attempt to capture divine insight in a notebook. The cultural context is fascinating. Wealthy collectors treat mushrooms like rare jewellery, while others treat them like spiritual keys to worlds unseen. The contrast produces a gentle irony. Humans, convinced of sophistication, are often the most easily startled by the very organisms they seek to understand. You wander among the salons, inhaling the faint aroma of wet earth and ink, noting the quiet laughter of nature as humans perform the timeless dance of curiosity mixed with vanity. By 1930, while science has not yet fully grasped the subtleties of psilocybin or the deeper psychedelic properties of these fungi, humans are already beginning to glimpse their profound, mischievous charm. You notice the pattern. Fascination fuels experimentation. Experimentation fuels stories. Stories feed curiosity, patience, and inevitably humour. The mushrooms have endured centuries of observation, misunderstanding, and reverence, quietly guiding humans through lessons in humility, imagination, and subtle absurdity. And as you step back from the manicured garden, leaving behind tweed jackets and candlelight salons, you feel the familiar shiver of recognition. Curiosity, even when wrapped in vanity and the trappings of wealth, has always led humans into wonder, occasional chaos, and the subtle guidance of the patient, wry, and slightly mischievous mushrooms. You step into a world increasingly dominated by bureaucracy, uniforms, and the urgent hum of modernity. Laboratories smell faintly of antiseptic, metal, and ink, and somewhere in the background, a filing cabinet groans under the weight of rules, regulations, and reports that no one can quite remember writing. Mushrooms, of course, remain entirely indifferent to all this human fuss. They push quietly through soil, moss, and forgotten corners, waiting patiently for anyone curious enough or desperate enough to notice. This is an era when hallucinogens are politely ignored, officially sidelined, and occasionally treated as dangerous curiosities. You wander through a laboratory somewhere in Europe or North America, a faint chill from the drafty windows brushing your neck, where chemists and toxicologists handle fungi with extreme caution or absurd overcaution. Do not inhale more than 0.03 grams of spores in a closed room, reads one sign. Somewhere a mushroom cap leans slightly, amused by the precision of the humans who assume it could care about gram-level measurements. Early chemical studies of mushrooms emerge cautiously. You watch scientists titrate, distill, and analyse tiny caps, often producing results that are as useful as they are hilariously tentative. Some notes read like warnings, potentially hallucinogenic, possibly psychoactive, likely safe if ignored. Exercise extreme caution, seriously. Somewhere in the lab, a technician accidentally tips a jar, spilling spores across the table. A mushroom wobbles, silently mocking, while the humans scramble with absurd seriousness to contain what is effectively a tiny cloud of irony. World events intrude. The Great Depression, rising tensions in Europe, and eventually war dominate minds and funding. Psychedelics, along with poetry, daydreaming, and excessive curiosity, are politely shoved aside. You walk through a bureaucratic office stacked with folders marked Mushroom Investigation, 1938, imagining the papers sighing with frustration at their own futility. Somewhere a mushroom grows quietly behind the building, perfectly aware that human attention is fleeting, but that its own legacy is infinitely patient. Even under repression, human curiosity persists. Amateur mycologists, explorers, and occasional rebellious chemists continue private studies, scribbling in diaries, taking careful notes, and sometimes ignoring regulations entirely. You sense the faint thrill of secrecy in these acts. Someone quietly testing a specimen, another observing forest growth patterns, all under the watchful eye of supervisors who imagine themselves guardians of reason rather than participants in the timeless game of observation and error. Humour naturally emerges from human rigidity. You notice absurd safety regulations. Gloves must be worn, masks must be worn, shoes must be polished, notebooks must be bound correctly, and the mushrooms, naturally, remain unimpressed by every precaution. Somewhere in a corner, a cat leans slightly as if to whisper, "Yes, human. All of this is adorable, and you will never truly contain me." Meanwhile, someone else trips over a hose, spills chemical, and mutters about liability forms as spores drift faintly across polished floors. You cannot help but notice the gentle comedy of effort meeting indifference. Wartime pressures amplify the humour and absurdity. You can almost hear a sergeant muttering about dangerous fungi in the lab, while a chemist quietly observes a tiny cluster of mushrooms with fascination that borders on reverence. Spies and security regulations complicate matters further. Must every experimental note be stamped, signed, and filed in triplicate? Indeed, mushrooms do not care. They grow in corners, under benches, behind filing cabinets, and in the quiet spaces between human obsession and negligence. Despite repression, curiosity ensures that knowledge does not vanish. You observe clandestine experiments, secret diary entries, and private excursions into the woods, where subtle lessons are quietly transmitted. Mushrooms, patient as ever, teach humans humility, perseverance, and the art of observing quietly while everyone else fusses. You notice how even small errors, misidentified species, overdosed experiments, mild hallucinations, serve as both entertainment and education, blending history, humour and discovery seamlessly. By the end of this period, the lesson is clear. Humans will always attempt to control, regulate and ignore what fascinates them. Mushrooms will always endure, quietly correcting assumptions, inspiring subtle wonder, and occasionally producing mild chaos. You step back from the drafty laboratories, file cabinets, and overcautious supervisors, inhaling the faint scent of wet earth and spores, and feel the familiar shiver of recognition. Curiosity, humour and patience remain timeless. Mushrooms have survived wars, regulations and human folly, and in their quiet, resilient and slightly mischievous way, they continue to teach humans that wonder is rarely polite, understanding is optional, and history is always stranger and funnier than regulations suggest. You step now into a rainforest where the air is thick, humid and vibrating with life. The scent of wet earth and flowering plants hangs around you like a persistent invisible shawl. Somewhere, insects hum in harmonious chaos, leaves glisten with water, and small mushrooms peek timidly from the undergrowth, their caps like shy little witnesses to human curiosity. It is the 1950s, and the modern world is rediscovering what humans have known, and occasionally misinterpreted for millennia. Anthropologists, explorers, and slightly overdressed intellectuals step cautiously into these humid jungles, notebooks and cameras in hand, unsure whether they're about to witness spiritual revelation or collapse from heat exhaustion. You notice them wiping sweat off their foreheads, adjusting ill-fitting safari hats, and muttering about the exotic customs they have come to document. Somewhere in the undergrowth, a mushroom watches with quiet amusement, entirely aware of the absurd spectacle humans make when seeking understanding of what they barely know. R. Gordon Wasson, the intrepid and slightly obsessed ethnomycologist, leads one such expedition. You walk beside him, or perhaps through him, as the second-person perspective allows, observing his meticulous preparation, the careful notes, the whispered excitement when local Mazatec guides reveal sacred mushrooms called teonanacatl. You feel the tension and reverence in the air, the knowledge, the history, and the subtle humour of humans attempting to step lightly into rituals older than empires. The Mazatec ceremonies are at once solemn, mystical, and slightly chaotic, though chaos, of course, is a subtle teacher. You see candlelight flickering across stone altars, faint shadows dancing on walls and faces. Participants chant, hum, and share small doses of mushrooms that will soon colour perception, evoke visions, and produce faint giggles at the edges of consciousness. Anthropologists, meticulously respectful but hopelessly out of their comfort zones, often wobble on wooden floors, trip over ceremonial props, or mutter about how one should not have eaten breakfast so hastily. You notice, with gentle amusement, how seriously they attempt to maintain decorum while the mushrooms quietly rewrite their understanding of the world. Rainfall punctuates the ceremonies. You feel the warm, wet drops on your skin, hear the soft patter on leaves, smell the dampness in the air, and watch as mushrooms in the clearing seem to nod imperceptibly, as if approving the human folly unfolding in their presence. Visions shimmer, faint geometric patterns, faintly ridiculous apparitions, colours blending and bending in ways that defy the very vocabulary attempting to describe them. You sense that every misstep, every overzealous note, and every fumbled observation is part of the ongoing lesson. Humans are excellent at curiosity, terrible at control, and endlessly entertaining to patient fungi. Wasson and his peers publish their findings with a mixture of rigour, awe, and understated humour. Articles in Life magazine bring these rituals into the Western imagination, inspiring fascination, imitation, and occasional confusion. You can almost hear the faint snickers of history echoing. Humans formalise ceremonies in print, attempt to classify experiences, and yet completely miss the subtle lessons whispered by centuries of practice and observation. Humour persists in human attempts to replicate the ceremonies outside their context. You witness an eager enthusiast in New York carefully spreading mushroom spores on a dinner plate, adjusting the lighting for authentic mystical experience, and promptly regretting the decision when reality, digestive systems, and domestic pets intervene. Meanwhile, somewhere deep in Oaxaca, the Mazatec continue the same rituals they have for generations, entirely unimpressed by the spectacle of Western experimentation. By the end of the 1950s, the rediscovery is clear. Mushrooms have emerged from obscurity in the Western imagination, inspiring scientific curiosity, anthropological fascination, and the faintest undercurrent of cultural chaos. You feel the quiet thrill of recognition. Centuries of indigenous knowledge, patient fungi and human curiosity converge in ceremonies that are equal parts reverence, education, and gentle absurdity. And as you step back from the flickering candlelight, the soft humming of chants still in the air, you realize that mushrooms have once again reminded humans of their limits, their tendencies toward overconfidence, and their endless capacity for wonder. In the moist, shadowed jungles of Mexico, mushrooms endure, teaching patience, subtle humor, and the timeless lesson that some knowledge cannot be rushed, packaged, or neatly recorded, only experienced. You step into a decade where civilization seems to have decided collectively that rules are optional, clothing is interpretive, and music should vibrate through the very bones of existence. The street smell of incense, damp earth, and a faint hint of revolution, all blending into an aroma both intoxicating and confusing. Somewhere, mushrooms peek from gardens, forests, and living rooms, grinning invisibly at the spectacle of humans eager to expand their minds, or at least their sense of fashion. The counterculture emerges with glorious chaos. You wander among communes, university campuses, and city lofts where young people, hair long and thoughts longer, experiment with mushrooms, LSD, and every curious combination of colours, sounds, and smells they can muster. You watch someone trip gently over their own sandals while reciting a poem about infinity, a faintly amused mushroom quietly observing the spectacle from a windowsill. Here, decorum is a memory, and exuberance is mandatory. Timothy Leary strides confidently through this landscape, exuding a sense of purpose and the faint whiff of both genius and mischief. You sense the undercurrent of excitement as he encourages volunteers to turn on, tune in, drop out, blissfully ignoring the fact that dropping out occasionally involves furniture, pets, or unsuspecting friends. Somewhere, a mushroom cap nods knowingly. Humans are loud, messy, and enthusiastic, but remarkably consistent across centuries. Fashion is an experimental battleground. You note bell-bottoms swirling in kaleidoscopic patterns, tie-dyed shirts that almost seem sentient, beads clattering like tiny bells with each movement. Someone has strung mushrooms on necklaces, unintentionally demonstrating that admiration and taste occasionally diverge in ways both hilarious and confusing. You inhale the rich, dense air of incense, sweat, and faint damp spores, sensing that every sensory input is amplified, distorted, or gently mocked by the fungi themselves. Mushrooms are now both teachers and muses. In classrooms of the forest, living rooms, and experimental labs, humans attempt to record experiences, write manuals, and codify visions that are by nature fleeting, whimsical, and sometimes absurdly literal. You watch a student trace fractal patterns on a notepad while humming in harmony with wind chimes, only to realize that the mushroom, patient and eternal, has long since moved on to teaching humility and subtle humor. The popular imagination embraces psychedelics with a mixture of awe, fear, and mild chaos. Music festivals, gatherings, and secretive experiments flourish, each event a microcosm of curiosity, enthusiasm, and occasional disaster. You feel the warmth of a communal drum circle vibrating through your body, hear laughter echoing across sun-dappled fields, and note the gentle absurdity of humans attempting to rationalize experiences that defy language. Somewhere, a mushroom quietly takes notes, adding small ironic flourishes to history. Legal pressures emerge, producing a peculiar humour of their own. You imagine bureaucrats drafting laws while secretly wondering if their carefully combed hair has caught a hint of psychedelic inspiration. Mushroom enthusiasts continue experimentation, often with improvised dosages, handmade manuals, and a gleeful disregard for authority. Somewhere in the corner a fungus leans, silently whispering, "Yes, human." All of this is entertaining and entirely predictable. The decade produces cultural milestones. Mushrooms appear in art, literature and conversation, sometimes revered, sometimes mocked, always intriguing. You walk through a gallery of psychedelic prints, feeling as if the walls themselves are pulsing gently, each stroke a subtle nod to centuries of human fascination with fungi. The mushroom watches, patient as ever, amused by every attempt at artistic replication, every misunderstanding, every earnest endeavour to capture wonder in pigment, word, or performance. By the end of the 1960s, the lesson is clear. Mushrooms have emerged as symbols of curiosity, rebellion, and imagination. They inspire awe, chaos, and subtle humour, reminding humans that even in a decade of exuberance, patience, and perspective remain vital. You feel the shiver of recognition. Humans may change hairstyles, music, and social norms, but mushrooms endure, quietly teaching the same lessons across centuries: humility, wonder, and the gentle absurdity of taking oneself too seriously. And as the tie-dye swirls fade into memory and incense smoke drifts lazily through empty streets, you sense the timeless presence of fungi, observing with bemusement, guiding with subtlety, and gently nudging humanity toward the realization that the world is stranger, funnier, and infinitely more alive than any manifesto, manual, or drum circle could ever contain. You step into a world of shag carpets, bell-bottoms, and the lingering scent of incense that refuses to leave any room, no matter how many open windows you politely offer. The 1970s arrive with swagger, kaleidoscopic colours, and an increasingly complicated relationship between humans and mushrooms. You wander through record stores, living rooms, and art studios where fungi have become more than mystical teachers. They are symbols, icons, punchlines, and occasional sources of mild panic. Mushrooms now appear everywhere. Album covers, psychedelic posters, comic strips, and the odd mural in a city subway. You notice someone sketching a mushroom with exaggerated eyes and a goofy grin, claiming it represents the universe's sense of humour. Nearby, a musician pens lyrics about mushrooms dancing in moonlight, while inadvertently stepping on a cat. Somewhere, the fungi are quietly delighted. Humans, it seems, have discovered the art of misunderstanding with spectacular consistency. Legal restrictions tighten, producing absurd contradictions. You pass a library where one book describes psilocybin as a tool for spiritual insight, while another pamphlet warns of dire consequences for merely thinking about a mushroom. Bureaucrats, red-faced and slightly bewildered, attempt to classify what humans have been experimenting with for millennia, unaware that the mushrooms themselves are impervious to paperwork, warnings, or stern glances. Somewhere, a small cap nods knowingly, observing that human folly is the true constant of history. Pop culture exaggerates with delightful zeal. You hear jokes on late-night radio about magic mushrooms and houseplants conspiring against homeowners, spot cartoon strips where tiny fungi stage revolutions in kitchen pantries, and notice how every article alternates between fear, fascination, and accidental comedy. You feel the gentle rhythm of irony pulsing through society. The more humans worry, the more mushrooms quietly flourish, both literally and metaphorically. Music and art flourish under their influence. You stand in a gallery where colours swirl unnaturally, shapes bend playfully, and a small sculpture, a mushroom made from papier-mâché and glitter, sits in quiet judgment. Rock musicians write lyrics of cosmic journeys, folk singers recount journeys into enchanted forests, and somewhere a DJ spins tracks meant to simulate the sound of a mushroom's laughter. You inhale the faint scent of varnish, incense and moss, sensing that mushrooms have transcended the purely botanical and entered the realm of cultural archetype, mysterious, mischievous, and endlessly adaptable. Human misunderstanding becomes part of the charm. Someone attempts a scientific reenactment in a city apartment, ignoring dosage, ventilation, and common sense. You see the faint chaos unfold, furniture slightly rearranged, carpets patterned with inexplicable stains, and a cat judging everything silently from the windowsill. The mushrooms, patient as ever, observe without comment, their subtle humour hidden in the gentle quiver of a cap or the tilt of a stem. The decade also witnesses media exaggeration. Newspaper headlines warn of mass hallucinations, moral decay, or the fungal threat lurking in your backyard, while simultaneously publishing tips for growing your own psychedelic plants with euphemistic caution. You notice the quiet lesson. Fear, fascination, and humour often travel in the same sentence when humans attempt to control what they do not understand. Somewhere in the grass, a mushroom watches, impervious to hype, reminding anyone paying attention that its lessons are learned best through curiosity, care, and just a touch of humility. By the end of the 1970s, mushrooms occupy multiple roles: educational tools, cultural symbols, comic relief, and persistent reminders of humanity's tendency to exaggerate. You sense the gentle rhythm of history. Humans invent chaos, codify rules, misinterpret experiences, and occasionally stumble upon insight, all while the fungi endure. Their patient presence, subtle humour, and quiet guidance persist, teaching that perception is a fluid, sometimes ridiculous thing, and that wonder cannot be legislated or confined to headlines. And as you walk away from the swirl of posters, record stores, and slightly exaggerated media coverage, you feel it again, this shiver of recognition. Mushrooms have observed centuries of human curiosity, folly, and imagination. They endure, quietly correcting assumptions, provoking laughter, and subtly guiding humans toward humility, patience, and the occasional profound insight. In this decade of shag carpets and media spectacle, the lesson is clear. Humans may misinterpret, exaggerate, and panic, but mushrooms remain ever patient, slightly mischievous, and infinitely more reliable teachers than anyone dares admit. You step into a quieter world, where neon lights buzz faintly over suburban streets, cassette tapes hiss from stereo decks, and mushrooms have retreated from the chaotic spotlight of pop culture into shadows both literal and metaphorical. The 1980s arrive with shoulder pads, fluorescent colours, and an understated human tendency to forget, for a moment, that the world of fungi continues, quietly in the forests, backyards, and even inside the pages of obscure guidebooks. The mushrooms thrive in subtlety. You walk down a trail where pine needles cushion your steps, the faint scent of damp earth rising to meet the occasional whiff of exhaust from passing cars. Hidden under trees, among moss and leaf litter, they form quiet communities, entirely indifferent to humanity's obsession with status, wealth, or fame. You notice the patient humour in their posture, as if they have been waiting for decades, centuries really, for humans to remember them in their own peculiar way. Human engagement becomes clandestine, deliberate, and occasionally ridiculous. Secret mushroom clubs spring up in college, basements, apartment lofts, and forest clearings. You find yourself standing among whispered conversations, scattered notes, and oddly decorated living rooms where enthusiasts carefully measure spores and pass around advice written in fine script on yellowed paper. Do not mix with coffee, one note reads. Somewhere a mushroom observes with quiet amusement, perfectly aware that rules are made to be misread misapplied, or creatively interpreted. Guidebooks emerge, each more imaginative than the last. You notice diagrams of caps, stems, and spore prints that resemble tiny abstract art pieces, alongside instructions that oscillate between meticulous science and borderline fairy tale. Someone advises, if it smells like the forest after rain, it is probably harmless. Probably. Another adds, beware the one that hums at midnight, only slightly more dangerous than your neighbour's dog. Somewhere in the grass, a mushroom wobbles in delight, amused at how seriously humans take these whimsical suggestions. The underground culture thrives on shared curiosity and gentle absurdity. College campuses become informal research grounds. You step through dormitories where posters of mushrooms adorn walls alongside cassette players looping ethereal music, and where whispered rumours circulate about experiments in perception. Humans, ever dramatic, occasionally overestimate effects, mislabel species, or forget entirely to respect both the fungi and common sense. Each mishap produces laughter, anecdote, and the faint lesson that patience and observation are more valuable than manuals, rumours, or bravado. The decade also produces sensory immersion in unexpected places. Forests, city parks, and abandoned lots become temporary classrooms of observation. You feel the crunch of leaves beneath your feet, hear distant traffic blend in with bird calls, and smell moss and decaying wood mixed faintly with curiosity. Mushrooms remain entirely patient, watching, teaching without words, and occasionally nudging humans toward humility. A spore drifts across your hand, invisible, light as a sigh, a quiet reminder that nature's humour is subtle, enduring, and entirely uncontainable. Some humour arises from human attempts at secrecy. You overhear stories of misadventures, someone mistaking a poisonous species for an edible one, a clandestine gathering interrupted by confused neighbours, or a guidebook that instructs readers to listen to the mushroom but not too closely. You feel the gentle rhythm of irony. Humans invent complexity, rules, and drama, while mushrooms endure, quiet, patient, and perfectly capable of letting humans amuse themselves. Research continues quietly, academically, and sporadically. Ethnobotanists correspond in discreet letters, labs conduct cautious studies, and some enthusiasts record personal experiences in meticulously typed journals. You notice the contrast between dedication and absurdity. While humans meticulously track every variable, the fungi continue to observe, influence, and gently correct assumptions with each unsuspecting visitor who wanders into their domains. By the 1990s, mushrooms are masters of subtlety, existing on the periphery of human consciousness and culture. You feel the quiet lesson. Fascination can persist without fame. Knowledge can exist in whispers, and humour, gentle and ironic, is often the best teacher. Somewhere in a shadowed forest a mushroom tilts, acknowledges your presence, and whispers, if you listen carefully, human curiosity is eternal, and so is our patience. And as you step away from the quiet gatherings, mossy forests, and yellowed guidebooks, you feel that familiar shiver of recognition. Mushrooms endure, unseen but never absent, quietly guiding humans through lessons of humility, wonder, and subtle humour. Obscurity has not diminished their influence. It has refined it, teaching that the most profound insights often arrive not in public spectacle, but in whispered observation, patient study, and the gentle, enduring humour of nature itself. You step into a world where white coats, computer screens, and PowerPoint presentations reign supreme. The 2000s arrive, bringing an age of cautious curiosity, digital record-keeping, and scientists who simultaneously revere mushrooms and fear spilling coffee on their meticulously labelled vials. Somewhere, a mushroom peeks from the edge of a lab bench, its cap tilted as if to ask, "Really? You've waited 5,000 years to study me properly." The modern scientific approach is both rigorous and slightly awkward. You watch researchers measure, titrate, and observe with exacting precision. Their expressions a mix of awe and mild terror. Volunteers sit quietly, heart rates monitored, electrodes attached, fMRI machines humming like gentle mechanical bees. Somewhere a mushroom drifts a faint spore, entirely unconcerned with ethics approvals, consent forms, or IRB protocols. Its patience is infinite, your nervous excitement is not. Psilocybin emerges from obscurity into the labs of Johns Hopkins, Imperial College, and other cautiously enthusiastic institutions. You feel the tension. Researchers tiptoe between curiosity and caution, trying to quantify subjective experience. Volunteers describe visions, altered perception, and insights into themselves, often accompanied by awkward laughter or sudden fascination with the texture of a ceiling tile. Somewhere in the corner, a mushroom tilts knowingly. Yes, human. This is exactly how it has always been. Humour arises in the small human details. A researcher spills a cup of coffee, sending a cascade of brown liquid near a carefully labelled tray of spore syringes. A volunteer accidentally knocks over a clipboard while attempting to describe the colour of Aurora Borealis in a cup of tea. Somewhere another experimenter adjusts the lighting to simulate a forest canopy, only to realise they have inadvertently cast shadows resembling a flock of confused birds. The mushrooms, eternally patient, observe all this quietly, their subtle amusement unmeasurable in charts or graphs. The decade marks a profound shift. Mushrooms are no longer merely curiosities, symbols, or underground companions. They are subjects of serious, controlled study. Researchers examine therapy for depression, anxiety, PTSD, and existential distress. You feel the careful rhythm of clinical sessions where volunteers lie on soft mats, headphones delivering gentle music, and the scent of faint incense mingles with antiseptic. Somewhere, the fungi remind you that while humans need decades, protocols, and peer-reviewed papers, the effects themselves have been quietly understood for millennia. Field studies blend historical observation with modern methodology. You walk alongside ethnobotanists tracing indigenous practices, noting ceremonial methods, and attempting, with varying degrees of success, to reconcile ancient wisdom with contemporary science. Occasionally, someone misplaces a field notebook, another forgets sunscreen, and yet another becomes so absorbed in the forest's subtle symphony that they miss a mild rain shower. Mushrooms, patient and slightly sarcastic, nod imperceptibly. Humans excel at both fascination and forgetfulness. Public interest grows cautiously. News articles celebrate breakthroughs while maintaining a safe distance from full enthusiasm. You read headlines like, "Mushrooms as Medicine," "Researchers Investigate," or "Science Finally Acknowledges Ancient Curiosity," each with accompanying stock photos of perfectly symmetrical fungi. Somewhere a mushroom wobbles slightly, amused at the irony. Humans, 5 millennia into observation, are just beginning to formalise what nature has been teaching patiently all along. The humour of the era is gentle, understated, and entirely human. Volunteers describe visions of kaleidoscopic forests, cosmic rivers, and laughing animals, often accompanied by chuckles of self-awareness or embarrassment. You feel the warmth, scent, and quiet intensity of these sessions, noting how mushrooms continue to blend science, therapy, and subtle comedy in ways only partially captured by research papers. By the end of the 2000s, the lesson is clear. Mushrooms, once sidelined, misunderstood, or relegated to the fringes, have re-entered human consciousness in a new form, serious, respected, and yet impossibly patient. You sense the gentle rhythm of history. Humans may lag in understanding, fumble with procedure, and occasionally spill coffee, but the fungi endure, guiding perception, inspiring insight, and quietly laughing at every misstep. And as you leave the hum of the lab, the scent of antiseptic lingering faintly in your memory, you feel the familiar shiver of recognition. Mushrooms have once again reminded humans of patience, curiosity, and the subtle humour that underlies millennia of interaction. Their lessons are timeless. Wonder cannot be rushed, insight cannot be forced, and humour, gentle and ironic, is as essential to human experience as observation itself. You step into a decade where mushrooms, once whispered about in basements and cautiously observed in laboratories, now appear on Instagram feeds, in wellness blogs, and at festivals glowing with fairy lights. The 2010s are a world of selfies, hashtags and avocado toast, and somewhere in the corner of every trendy cafe or co-working space, a mushroom watches silently, unimpressed by human attempts to aestheticize wonder. Influencers hold tiny, perfectly staged mushrooms between manicured fingers, captions like "spiritual awakening, one spore at a time," hovering above filtered photos. You notice the faint aroma of essential oils mingling with coffee, a juxtaposition almost worthy of a chuckle from any patient fungus. Somewhere, a mushroom cap tilts, as if whispering, "Yes, humans are still easily entertained and still entirely predictable. Science marches alongside style. Clinical studies continue at institutions cautiously embracing the trend, now sharing findings that sometimes intersect with Instagram-ready wellness culture. Volunteers microdose, journals track mood improvements, and therapy sessions adopt mindfulness techniques with subtle nods to digital aesthetics. You feel the curious tension. Rigorous research exists side by side with yoga mats and matcha lattes, producing a culture equal parts serious, frivolous, and often absurd. Mushrooms become celebrities in their own right. Festival stages host talks on psilocybin research. Tiny informational pamphlets float around music gatherings, and pop-up experiences advertise guided fungal journeys with soundscapes and ambient lighting. You wander through these spaces sensing the faint smell of incense grass and damp earth, blended with the inevitable whiff of artisanal kombucha. Somewhere, a mushroom watches quietly, amused that humans have found so many ways to commercialize curiosity without entirely understanding it. Microdosing trends emerge with a peculiar blend of earnestness and bravado. You watch someone tap a tiny capsule into their latte while reading a self-help guide titled "Optimize Your Creativity with Fungi." Another participant records a TikTok claiming profound insights after eating what is essentially a slightly damp piece of fungus. You feel the irony, the gentle humour, and the consistent thread. Humans are forever eager to quantify wonder, occasionally inventing rules, rituals, and products along the way. Media coverage ranges from cautious admiration to exaggerated alarm. Articles praise cognitive benefits, spiritual experiences, and breakthroughs in mental health, while simultaneously warning of recreational hazards, bad trips, and kitchen table chemistry gone awry. Somewhere, a mushroom tilts ever so slightly, silently amused by headlines that swing from reverence to panic in a matter of paragraphs. Even wellness culture participates in subtle absurdity. Mushroom latte art becomes a thing. You smell earthy, slightly bitter coffee while admiring carefully swirled foam. Retreats promise personal transformation under the guise of spa experiences. Instagram filters turn natural light into magical glows, emphasizing mystical mushroom vibes. Somewhere, a mushroom observes, amused that human creativity is boundless when paired with slightly misguided enthusiasm. Despite commercialization, the fungi remain teachers. You feel the gentle reminder that insight, humour and humility persist whether humans are taking notes, posting stories, or sipping cappuccinos in the name of spiritual awakening. Festivals, blogs, and research labs converge into a kaleidoscope of curiosity, each experiment, photograph, or social post an homage to centuries of patient observation. By the end of the 2010s, the lesson is subtle yet unmistakable. Humans may attempt to frame, filter, and hashtag experience, but mushrooms endure as guides, mediators, and quiet observers of human folly. Their humour is gentle, their patience unbroken, and their capacity for teaching persists across mediums and decades. You feel the familiar shiver of recognition. Wonder cannot be commodified. Curiosity cannot be outsourced, and humour, gentle and ironic, remains the truest guide to understanding both the world and yourself. And as you step away from the filtered lights, the soft buzz of social media, and the fragrant clouds of wellness culture, you feel the timeless presence of fungi. Ever patient, ever observant, ever gently amused, they continue to teach the delicate balance between curiosity, humility, and the subtle humour of being human. You step into a world buzzing with uncertainty, legal shifts, and a quiet sense of collective curiosity, finally catching up with centuries of human observation. The 2020s greet you with headlines proclaiming psilocybin decriminalized in insert city here, and tweets suggesting that mushrooms are now the ultimate wellness trend. Somewhere, a patient fungus watches all this unfold, unimpressed and slightly amused, as if to say, "About time, humans. About time." Decriminalization sweeps across pockets of the globe. You walk through city streets where signage hints that law enforcement may now regard certain fungi with a shrug rather than a stern finger wag. Cafes cautiously advertise mushroom-themed drinks with disclaimers. Wellness blogs publish guides on mindful microdosing, and retreats flourish, blending therapy, meditation, and nature walks. Somewhere, a mushroom leans against a tree, silently chuckling at humanity's tendency to treat millennia of observation as breaking news. Therapeutic research blossoms, cautious but promising. Hospitals, clinics, and academic institutions explore psilocybin for depression, PTSD, anxiety, and existential distress. Volunteers lie on mats beneath gentle lighting, music flowing softly around them, while researchers record heart rates, neural patterns, and verbal reflections. You notice the quiet humour. After thousands of years of folk wisdom and ceremonial use, humans are finally attempting controlled studies, while mushrooms have been perfecting subtle guidance for centuries. Public interest is high and slightly chaotic. Social media posts flaunt mushroom experiences, wellness podcasts wax poetic about spiritual enlightenment, and YouTube videos promise guided journeys with the perfect ambient soundtrack. You hear the occasional whispered cautionary tale about over-enthusiastic trips, mistaken identification, or someone attempting a retreat in a living room decorated like an enchanted forest. Mushrooms, ever patient, observe all of it, bemused, their subtle irony unrecorded in any journal or research paper. Humour emerges in bureaucracy. You imagine officials slowly realising that fungi are interesting, that perhaps centuries of warning and restriction were slightly overzealous, and that policies require thoughtful reconsideration. Tiny scandals arise. A city council accidentally cites the wrong species in a press release. A therapy clinic mislabels signage. A wellness retreat accidentally schedules a yoga class in a mushroom field at high noon. Somewhere the fungi tilt their caps as if to say, "Yes, your human tendency toward chaos continues to delight us. Sensory impressions abound. You wander through retreats where pine-scented forests mingle with soft mats and meditation bells, through city gardens hosting workshops on fungi identification, through laboratory corridors humming with monitoring equipment and quiet excitement. Everywhere, mushrooms remain observant, patient, and quietly teaching. Insight, humility, and humour endure as reliably as spores drifting on the breeze. Cultural perception shifts subtly but significantly. Podcasts, documentaries, and articles approach psilocybin and fungi with a blend of respect, curiosity, and occasional bemusement. You notice the gentle irony. Humans finally acknowledging the wisdom of experiences that indigenous peoples, shamans, and underground enthusiasts have known for centuries. Somewhere, a mushroom leans slightly, approvingly. Humans are learning, albeit slowly, that mushrooms are not mere novelty, nor mere symbol. They are teachers, guides, and mirrors of perception. By the decade's midpoint, the lesson is clear. Mushrooms are no longer hidden, ignored, or misunderstood. They exist publicly, academically, therapeutically, and culturally, yet maintain their patient, subtle humour. You feel the familiar shiver of recognition as you observe human excitement, missteps, and tentative discoveries. Nothing about humanity has changed entirely, and yet something is shifting. The fungi continue to teach. Curiosity matters, patience matters, and humour, gentle, ironic, enduring, remains essential. And as you step away from urban gardens, therapy mats, research labs, and social media posts, you feel the quiet, timeless presence of fungi. Ever patient, subtly ironic, and infinitely observant, they remind you, as they have for millennia, that the world is stranger, funnier, and infinitely richer than human haste, headlines, or bureaucratic caution might suggest. Curiosity is eternal, insight is timeless, and humour, quiet, whimsical, and ever persistent, is the constant companion of those willing to pay attention. You step back, or perhaps forward, or sideways, depending on how you consider time, into a quiet, luminous place that feels like all centuries at once. The forest floor of Siberia, the candlelit temples of Mesoamerica, medieval European villages, 1970s festival fields, underground 1990s basements, sterile 2000s labs, and neon-splashed Wasson cafes merge into a single, endless present. Here, mushrooms are eternal. You feel them everywhere, in the spore-dusted soil, in the faint aroma of damp wood, in the invisible currents of air that whisper secrets no human has yet fully understood. Humans, of course, continue their clumsy dance. You watch as someone misreads a guidebook, another organises a retreat. With a playlist too loud, a third meticulously documents a lab observation only to forget a pen cap. Somewhere, a mushroom wobbles ever so slightly, amused. Its patience is infinite, its humour subtle but enduring. You sense that the core lesson across millennia is unchanged. Curiosity is immortal, mistakes are inevitable, and wonder is the reward of those willing to pay attention. History, you realise, is not a series of discrete events, but a vast swirling continuum of observation, experimentation, misunderstanding, and awe. From shamans chewing Siberian fungi, to Mazatec priests whisper into the gods, from medieval monks squinting at illuminated manuscripts, to hippies dancing in psychedelic forests, from secret 1980s clubs to carefully controlled 21st century labs, the story flows like a gentle river, carrying human folly, laughter, insight, and occasional terror in equal measure. You follow the current, feeling it ripple through your thoughts, sometimes tickling, sometimes nudging, always guiding. Humour threads through every age. You see it in the ironic surprise of a medieval peasant realizing the chamber pot water you just dodged is slightly warmer than expected. You hear it in the whispered panic of a 1970s enthusiast who misidentified a mushroom and discovered only mild nausea instead of apocalypse. You sense it in the quiet smirk of a 2000s researcher who spills coffee on a tray of meticulously labelled syringes. The humour is gentle, pervasive, and timeless. A reminder that the universe, like mushrooms themselves, thrives on subtle mischief. Sensory memories converge around you. You feel the squish of damp earth underfoot, smell pine needles, incense, and old paper. Hear distant bells, laughter, rustling leaves, and the faint hum of electric lights in modern labs. Colours shift fluidly. The red of an Aztec temple, the muted pastels of a 1970s poster, the sterile whites of a lab, the filtered gold of a wellness cafe. Every sense reminds you that mushrooms are guides not just in history, but in perception, gently shaping how humans experience the world, one subtle influence at a time. You notice their subtle commentary on human nature. Patience is a virtue humans rarely practice. Foresight is fleeting, and enthusiasm often outpaces understanding. Mushrooms, eternally observant, offer a quiet mirror. Humans stumble, experiment, panic, celebrate, misinterpret, and sometimes achieve clarity. And through it all the fungi endure, teaching not with admonition but with gentle irony, persistent presence, an occasional wonder so profound that it leaves humans blinking, silent and awed. Time becomes irrelevant. The centuries blur into a tapestry threaded with curiosity, misadventure, insight, and laughter. You feel the pull of all histories at once. Siberian shamans laughing under birch trees, Aztec priests chanting in candlelight, medieval villagers squinting at mossy manuscripts, 1970s rockers dancing in kaleidoscopic lights, underground, enthusiasts whispering in basements, scientists documenting neural patterns, and social media influencers sipping mushroom lattes. Each moment is distinct, yet connected. A single, flowing narrative that hums beneath the ordinary rhythms of daily life. And as you breathe in this endless now, the final lesson emerges, clear yet subtle. Life is richer when observed with curiosity, guided by patience and softened with humour. Wonder cannot be legislated, commodified, or rushed. Yet it appears to all who notice in forests, temples, labs, basements, cafes, and even the quiet corners of your mind. Mushrooms, eternal companions, remind you that perception is as fluid as a drifting spore, that laughter is as vital as insight, and that humility is the bridge between experience and understanding. You step gently through this continuum, aware that history, humour, and observation are inseparable threads in the grand tapestry of existence. Somewhere, a mushroom tilts its cap ever so slightly, approving of your attention, patient and wise, and you, wandering across time, space, and perception, feel the soft, hypnotic rhythm of history itself, a gentle pulse that whispers, curiosity endures, insight is timeless, humour is eternal. And in that quiet, encompassing moment, the forest floor, candlelit temples, laboratory benches and neon-lit cafes all merge into one eternal presence. Mushrooms have observed humans for millennia, and humans, if only for a heartbeat of awareness, finally observe them back, noticing the subtle, endless humour in the patient, ever-present teachers beneath the caps, in the spores, and in the quiet spaces between moments. You exhale slowly, carrying with you a deep, calm recognition. Life is stranger, funnier, and infinitely richer than haste or fear might suggest. And somewhere, always, a mushroom is quietly, eternally smiling. Good night.